We know what our goals are. We know what we hope to accomplish.
When I walked in for the first time, and I was kind of flabbergasted, I think.
Oh, hello there. So glad you could come along. I am the Dream Finder.
We're leaving Main Street Station right now, so wave it goodbye.
Welcome to the Main Street Chronicles presents Untold Tales, Stories of Imagineering. Today we have former Vice President, Creative Director of Walt Disney Imagineering, Roger Holzberg, with us. I am Sam of Mama Bear Jamboree, and I'm joined here today with Brian and Stokes of the Main Street Chronicles. Roger, before we get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can dive into our questions.
Sure. Hi, my name is Roger Holzberg, and I would say my dream job in my life was to work at Walt Disney Imagineering, and you'll hear a little bit about how that was born, when I was really young. And as a creative person, Imagineering is the ultimate canvas because there isn't an artistic tool that's been created yet that doesn't have a place to go on that portfolio of programs, products, films, experiences. I grew up as a creative person after graduating from the California Institute of the Arts in the film world, in special effects, in art direction and production design. I ultimately wrote and directed a few films, and then I made a few IMAX movies, but then went to Imagineering to start working on experience design. They didn't call it that then, but that's clearly what it is. Experience design, putting people into worlds where they can experience worlds in new, interactive, and immersive ways is incredibly exciting. And people often ask me why I don't work at Imagineering anymore. And I would like to say that I would still, more than anything in life, like to be drinking that Kool-Aid. But about 15 years ago, I was diagnosed with cancer. And I knew at that point that I wanted to apply my talent to doing what we called at Disney the architecture of reassurance, but transforming that and transitioning it into an architecture of healing. So that's what I do with my current company, Reimagine Well.
Thanks for that, Roger. So let's get started with our first question. What qualities about the original Imagineers ultimately inspired you to want to become an Imagineer?
Great question. And when I was interviewing people at Imagineering for a job, I always liked to ask them, what's your first Disney experience? My first Disney experience almost made me never want to be an Imagineer or have anything to do with the Walt Disney Company again. When I was 5 years old, I saw the movie Sleeping Beauty. I didn't want to just see that movie. I wanted to be in that movie. So I begged my parents to get me a Prince Philip outfit, right? And they did. I put on the next day my plastic Prince Philip helmet and my plastic Prince Philip breastplate and scabbard and pulled my sword out and went to my grandmother's rose bushes out in the back of the yard. And I was going to recreate the scene where the prince hacks his way through that garden of thorns to kill the dragon and ultimately rescue the princess. Well, it turns out that my plastic swords didn't actually work against that rose bush. And when I was fully embedded, bleeding, with a helmet, plastic, pushed up against my mouth, calling for help, help, from the backyard, 20 plus stitches later, and more mercurochrome than I ever knew could be painted on a kid, I never wanted to see a Disney movie or have a Disney experience again for the rest of my life. Cut to 1964. I am almost 10 years old, and I get to go on my first trip to New York. I walked into a theater, and it was a little theater. and sat down with my family and believed that I saw Abraham Lincoln stand up out of a chair, walk down to the edge of a stage, come back to life, and talk to me. Walking out of the theater, I was so excited that I was pulling on my dad's sleeve, and I literally tore the sleeve of his jacket away from the shoulder. And he grabbed me and he said, "What's the matter?" And I said, Dad, how did that happen? That Abraham Lincoln just came back to life and talked to us. And he said, "A man named Walt Disney invented that." And that was the moment, right? So for me, it was the 1964 World's Fair. It was great moments with Mr. Lincoln. And from that moment forward, I thought what Disney did was magic. How come you're cracking up?
No, not cracking up. I'm holding back the tears there. That was
No, Sam's cracking up.
yeah, the World's Fair is, even though we weren't alive, it's one of the things that has hooked all of us. So that's to actually hear that that retelling of it hooking you literally in the moment.
And you are the most animated storyteller.
Okay, good.
I was going to say, we always hear about it from like a broad perspective, but hearing like a personal telling of somebody that was actually there, again, makes it so much more real.
Cool.
So what would you consider to be some of the best characteristics of an Imagineer?
I coined a phrase, fearless creativity. I use it when I teach at Cal Arts, and the legendary Imagineers all had it. That's the belief that there isn't a creative problem that with the right research, tools, and partnership, you can't solve. So I think, if there is a characteristic, it's the ability to believe in your own creative talent to the point where you can be fearless about the way you approach it.
I like that. I like that a lot. Now, can you share with us one of the hardest moments that you ever had with working at Walt Disney Imagineering?
We were installing One Man's Dream at the Disney MGM studios. We were not very far from opening because, as you know, a Disney celebration doesn't start on the first of the year. It starts 3 months before. The year was 2001, and a guard walked out to me and he said, "Did you hear? An airplane just hit the World Trade Center." And I said, "What do you mean?" And he said, like they think it was like a Cessna or something like that. They said it's burning. And I said, "Well, is there a TV around here anywhere?" And he said, "In that cast room over there, there's a TV." And I said, "Do you think I can go into that cast room and watch it?" And I remember his exact words. He looked at my badge, which had a gold stripe on it, which means I'm in a director or vice president level at the company. He says, "You have a gold stripe on your badge. I think you can go anywhere you want to go." And I walked through the door, and there was a wall, and a short wall, and just past it was a sofa, and it was a cast break room. And sitting on the sofa was Mickey Mouse, and perched on the back of the sofa was Ariel, and the second plane had just hit the second tower. I went around the corner and I looked at the TV and I looked back, and there is Mickey there's black makeup around their eyes, right? And just these streaks like running. And nobody knew what was going on yet, of course, right? I mean, a tower hadn't fallen yet. And I see that Mickey's handler, right, is looking at her watch and looking at me like, "You're a grown-up, do something. I got to get Mickey out on stage," right? And I'm looking at the TV, and I'm looking at this cast member, and the only thing I can think of to do is I walk over to the TV and I turn the volume off, right? And I walk up this close to her face and I said, "The world's going to be okay. We're all going to get through this. The world is really going to be okay, but you have to go on stage now. So your handler's going to help redo your makeup, and you'll go out on stage, and your shift isn't going to be that long, and then you'll come back in here and we'll see what's going on then," right? And her handler took her out on stage to perform. About 45 minutes later, the same security guard came up to me and he said, we've just gotten word from security, we have to evacuate the parks. Get all of your employees who are working backstage, who are not management, level managers or above, home and away off of the theme parks, and then come out with us into the park and help us find guests, because we're evacuating the parks in real time now. That Friday was the first time the parks were reopened, and everyone got back together at that point, and we made a big circle around in the center of the Disney MGM studios, and with guests and cast members, and everyone held hands, and we had a moment of silence. And I looked about 4 cast members to my right, and there was Mickey Mouse, right, who looked at me and then gave me, well, you can't do a peace sign with Mickey fingers, right? But the closest to a peace sign that you can do, right? And then went back to holding hands with the cast member next to her. So I don't know, I'd say that was the hardest moment, and it was certainly the most impactful in many ways.
It's amazing that we all know where we were when the world stopped turning for that day, September 11th, 2001. The 3 of us, we were still in school. I was in high school, and the other 2 were in middle school, and we can vividly remember exactly what we were doing and where we were, and even almost 20 years later, we've still got the emotions that flow through us. And that day, it shaped our lives forever, changed our courses even. To know that you were there in the happiest place on earth, which we all think is free from disaster and anything negative in the outside world, to hear the story that you just shared is it's really powerful, and it just brings back the emotions flooding back in like a wave. But you were right, the world was okay. We were okay, and we banded together like never before. And it's that was our generation's Pearl Harbor or Kennedy assassination, and it's very powerful. So thank you for sharing, because I know it wasn't easy for you to share that. So thank you for promising the cast and the guests at that time that the world would be okay, because at the time we didn't know that. We didn't know the world was going to be okay. All we could do was hope and pray, and unfortunately we're in similar times now where everything's uncertain, but the world will be okay. We'll all be okay. Let's take a second and compose ourselves before we continue on with the questions, because that was some really heavy stuff. So you, the listener, take a minute too. Take a minute to reflect on everything that we just shared, and give us a couple seconds and we'll be back to it.
Let's hop into our next question. What struggles do Imagineers today face that maybe our Imagineering legends didn't have to deal with?
When I was at Imagineering, it was led by Marty Sklar. And Marty Sklar came from the Walt Disney School of Imagineering and Leadership, which meant that you built and created from your imagination and your vision. Boy, I am sure some people won't like this, but Imagineering, even during the time that I was there, transitioned to being run not by the creative executives, but by the executives who came with degrees called MBAs. And initiatives in today's, entertainment, Imagineering, and creative world live on quarterly returns. The executives of the vision of Walt Disney and Marty Sklar, who could think generationally versus the next quarter or the next, cycle, I don't know that they exist in the world anymore. And that's a challenge. There was one of my favorite Walt Disney quotes of all times, and I used to quote it often when I was in meetings with MBAs who would say, well, how do you know this is going to return a 33% profit threshold after its investment in the first X number of months? And I'd say, let me hit you with this Walt Disney quote that's one of my favorites. Walt Disney once famously said, if I'd listened to my brother Roy, I'd have never made Snow White or built Disneyland. The greatest financial wisdom of the day said that Disneyland 1.0 would fail, that a $17 million investment, that was the price of Disneyland 1.0, that a $17 million investment could never be profitable because there was a perfect model right down the street. Knott's Berry Farm had been 10 miles away for decades, and everybody knew what Knott's Berry Farm's greatest season ever looked like. And if you multiplied that by factors of many, it would never equal and add up to $17 million over the course of a return on an investment. So the best financial projections of the day said Disneyland 1.0 would fail. We would not have had the industry of theme parks if Walt Disney had followed that wisdom, right? Much of the best wisdom of the day said that a feature-length animated movie would also fail, right? That there were optometrists who said it'll damage children's eyes if they watch an animated movie in a theater for 2 hours, right? The financial analysis of the day said parents won't spend money seeing a cartoon with their kids. Steve Jobs. I put Steve Jobs and Walt Disney in similar kinds of, categories. They were both visionaries who went bankrupt on ideas that didn't turn out to be as brilliant as they'd hoped, right? Steve Jobs once famously said, people don't know what they don't know. After something like 99 out of 100 people tested who focus grouped the first iPod, said they wouldn't buy it, right? iPod, of course, became iPhone, the most successful product in the history of the world, right? They both came from a world where if you're inventing something new, you can't attach an ROI to it. Nobody knows what it means to them yet. You can't attach a return of investment on a product that hasn't been conceived yet. And what the average person doesn't know what they don't know means is that the average person isn't trained to be an Imagineer, where you can look at some concept art and hear some concept story and then put yourself in the place with your imagination of what it will be like to be there, right? The average person can't do that.
So we've hit you with the challenges there. What would you say is your proudest moment working as an Imagineer?
Being the VP creative director on the One Man's Dream attraction was definitely my favorite experience and also had my proudest moment, I think. Marty Sklar could approve all of the elements that we had in the interactive walkthrough of Walt's life that had to do with Imagineering and the theme parks, but everything that had to do with Roy Disney and the family, Roy E. Disney had to approve. As you would expect Disney marketing to do, they mic'd both of us. There were cameras there. And it was the first time I met Roy. And if you look at pictures of Roy, he looks a lot like his dad and his uncle, right? And I believe he was 72 at the time. We started the walkthrough, and it was just fantastic. I mean, we walked through the first decade, which were really Walt and Roy's birth in Marceline and their early years. The teens when they were both in the military and what they were involved in there, the 20s when they were inventing animation and beginning to come up with characters and actually created Mickey Mouse. The 30s, when Roy Disney invented consumer products and literally saved the Lionel Train Company with a push car Mickey Minnie, right? Caboose car, right? And the 40s, and then the 50s, and the 50s set was Walt Disney's office. There were two things that as I was walking Roy through the attraction that stick in my mind about showing him that office. One was that office had been seen on stage before in Disneyland, but I had turned it 25 degrees counterclockwise so that we could see the wall where the master planning of Walt Disney World was going on while Walt Disney was still alive. Walt Disney only ever visited Central Florida once, but Walt Disney was doing the master planning of Walt Disney World from his office while he was sick. And at the very end, while he was literally on his deathbed at St. Joe's Hospital, dying of lung cancer, he was master planning the property that they had acquired, but he'd never seen it. In the concept art, he put where the freeway would be through Central Florida, which became the I-4. He had marked off not only where the Magic Kingdom was, because they had spotted where the castle was going to go for Magic Kingdom, but where the other theme parks that would go into Walt Disney World, Epcot, and the other parks would go. Roy looked at that and looked back at me, and he said, "You realize that that map that Walt was working on, he drew before any of this ever happened down here. I-4 is exactly where I-4 really is. The castles or the main icons for all of those theme parks are exactly where they were." And then we held our arms out and watched the hair on our arms stand on end, right? Then, not such a good one, we looked at the sofa and he said, "That was the sofa that was in Walt's room." He said, "Take a look at the legs." He said, "Do they look like they were sawed? Do they look like they were cut down to you?" And as soon as he said it, I looked at them and I went, "Yeah, the proportions look a little bit odd. Like that leg looks really short." He said, "I knew it," right? And I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I was just working for the studio at that point. I was the cinematographer on the True Life Adventures, and we'd only get one time with Walt to get notes." He said, "And he'd put us in that sofa, and Walt wasn't all that tall, but he wanted to be able to have his opinions mean something. I think he had the legs of that sofa cut down so that he could stand over you and be really tall and put his finger down and say, 'This is the way you need to do it.'" Anyway, that was really funny. Then the decade of the 70s was the launch of Walt Disney World. Walt Disney World was completed and launched by Roy Disney, Walt's brother, on a promise made on their deathbed. The decade for the 1970s was a simulation of the dedication of Walt Disney World. Walt Disney World happened because on Walt Disney's deathbed, he made his brother Roy promise that he would build Disney World, right? And Roy Disney agreed to it. Over the next 6 years, he basically worked himself to death to achieve his brother's vision. We had edited a piece of audio, and there was a full-sized Roy Disney stand-up. Roy E. Disney walked underneath the audio dome and heard his father say, "When my brother died, we didn't know if we'd be able to go on, but we picked ourselves back up by our bootstraps. We went back to work and we realized this dream. And today I'm dedicating this place, not Disney World, but Walt Disney World in my brother's name," right? And Roy Disney, having just heard his dad say those words, and I suspected something like this might happen, he does what a pro would do. He unclips his microphone, he takes off the battery pack, he sets them down on the ground, he walks over to a railing on the next set, and he starts crying, right? The head of marketing at Walt Disney World walks up behind me and pushes me, like, "Go do something," right? there's cameras rolling, there's microphones, right? I'm like, what do you do when a 72-year-old Roy Disney is crying on your attraction, right? I walked over to him, I put my arm around him, and I said, you actually never heard your dad say that, did you? He says, no. He said, my dad and Walt Disney were two of the most recorded men on the planet. And if you hired a sound-alike to sound like my dad, I'm going to be really pissed off. Where did you get that audio? And I said, yeah. I said, your dad wasn't feeling really well at the dedication for Walt Disney World, was he? He said, no. You see that picture you've got on the set? I'm the purple shape back there, a little bit behind over my dad's shoulder, or blue or whatever. He said, you know, it was a cold day. My dad was not feeling well. He had a bad cold. His voice didn't sound good. He didn't say that on that day. I said, I know. We went back in to find other audio that was recorded that week, and we edited this out of the dedication that your dad did for the Orlando Symphony. And he said, oh yeah, that happened on Monday. I couldn't go. I said, yeah, your dad sounded much stronger and much more vibrant, you know, on that dedication. You know, the cold hadn't hit him yet, but he kind of said the same words. Is it okay if we use that audio? And he said, yeah, it's fine. I said, anything else you want to tell us about that set? And he said, that card over there, we had these Translite connection cards, and they were about, 3 feet by about 2 feet, and they were a light box with Translite. And it was a great picture of his dad with his hard hat on, right, on the construction site. He said, that connection card Translite thing you've got over there. I said, yeah, is it okay? He said, yeah. Can you get me one for my office? And I said, yeah, I think we could do that. When do you want it? He said, as soon as I can have it. Are you available for lunch? I said, yeah. He said, great, come have lunch with us, right? So anyway, I think that was probably the moment.
Well, let's just keep the feels going. Let's go back to the first project you ever worked on. What was opening day like for you? What did it feel like? What were the emotions that you had for your first project that opened with Walt Disney Imagineering?
Yeah, so the first projects I worked on, I did not see through to completion, right? So, I'm going to answer it for the first project I worked on. I started on that. I then was still, a lot of Imagineers work on a lot of projects, but in different ways. So I had started on California Adventure projects and then transitioned on to the Millennium Celebration. Opening day on the Millennium Celebration was incredible. We had Maya Angelou as the spokesperson for the launch day. And we had built the idea of a celebration around countries sharing their gifts to the world with one another. And Maya Angelou recited her poem with the line that I will never forget, which is, we are more alike than different, my friends. And I was able to take my family back into Millennium Village, which was in Epcot World Showcase, where we had built a prototypical World Without Borders, in which students from the countries that were represented there were sharing their gifts from their countries with the world. And in that prototypical World Without Borders, we had Saudi Arabia next to Israel. It was incredible. It was before 9/11. It was a world that I think I dreamed about as a child of the 60s, and a world that I wished could exist today for my own children and for you. And it is a dream and a vision that I hope we can come back to somehow, because as Maya Angelou did so eloquently say, we are more alike than different.
I think we can all hope for that, and we'd all like to be a part of something like that. You have talked to us about starting projects that you weren't able to finish like California Adventure, and projects you have completed. Were there any projects that you worked on that didn't come into full production?
Yeah, great question. So Marty Sklar also used to have something that I wish existed at Imagineering today. I believe twice a year, I believe it happened twice a year, you could go into what he called the creative pitch off, and you would pitch an idea for something Disney should do. And then you would get a small budget to prototype it. Prior to coming to Disney, I had worked on IMAX movies, and I had done the IMAX movie, The Living Sea. I had worked with Ted Danson on helping to start American Oceans Campaign. And I was incredibly passionate, as I still am today, about the world oceans. And I pitched the idea of a next generation marine park where we never took large animals out of the ocean. We took people virtually into the ocean, and the large animals that we experienced were animatronic animals, right? Because the SeaWorld story that the only way you can learn about a dolphin or a killer whale is to take one out of its home and put it in jail is a lie. And Disney should create a next generation marine park to tell that story and do that messaging, environmental planetary stewardship in a different way. I won that creative pitch off, right? That session. And I got a small budget to go prototype a free swimming animatronic dolphin project. We prototyped it at the island that Disney had just acquired for the cruise line, where the robotic dolphin was played as an intelligent real dolphin that had learned how to understand English and was going to take guests on a tour of its world and teach guests about its world from the point of view of an animal that really lives there, right? And then the second prototype we did and ran for a week was at the Living Seas Pavilion at Epcot, where it was played as a robot, because Epcot, of course, is about science. And the robot basically worked as a sidekick to the marine biologist in the tank. So it could, essentially as a remote operated vehicle, but also as a sidekick to the diver in the tank. The testing for the attraction was off the charts, but Disney ultimately decided that getting into the marine park business was not something it was interested in doing. Totally made sense. And that Turtle Talk with Crush was a much more appropriate attraction to do because it could be in places where there were not water, right? Where it is now in almost all of the Disney theme parks worldwide and the cruise ships, right? But the Dolphin Robotic Unit project, and there is plenty of video on it. If you do a YouTube search of DRU, Dolphin Robot, DRU is Dolphin Robotic Unit, but I think it's DRU, you'll find it. So it was at Castaway Cay, also at the Living Seas Pavilion in Epcot. The video is from both places.
Okay, so just sitting here listening to all of your stories and just you talking in general, you sound like you're a pure Disney fan since you were a kid, kind of like all of us have been. And you've been lucky enough to be at some of the most influential moments in Disney history. You told a story about being able to see the Lincoln animatronic at the World's Fair and your dad telling you a man named Walt Disney created this. And that acted as like a big inspiration to you in your career goals. So what do you think Walt would think of the parks today?
I think he'd be underwhelmed. I think if Walt Disney were to travel the theme parks today, he would be underwhelmed. That's the way visionaries are. My understanding of the way that Walt Disney was, his imagination was so facile and so fast that once a vision was complete in his mind, he had moved on to the next thing. In many ways, the theme parks of today are just bigger, better versions of what Walt was trying to do in his day. I hate to say it, but I think he'd be underwhelmed. He'd be looking for something far more extraordinary.
Yeah, that is interesting because you do hear like his plans for Epcot are very different than the theme
Yes.
park that we actually got out of it.
Let's go there for a little bit. Yeah, Walt Disney deliberately during the Epcot broadcast called it two different things: the experimental prototype community of tomorrow and the experimental prototype city of tomorrow. And Walt Disney believed that the creativity that was developing Epcot should change the world, right? And it should change it on a societal level. He was that kind of thinker. Walt Disney was doing interactive cinema in his pitches to corporate sponsors, right? There were multiple projectors in the back room, and he was reading the room as it was happening, calling what projectors to go on, right, at what points during the pitch by how the room was reacting, right? I mean, he was so far beyond his years that yeah, I think he would be underwhelmed with what we've done today in themed entertainment.
Well, I think the next question may help us shape the future in a sense. With the parks, as you were just alluding to, Walt being underwhelmed, what advice would you give to the next generation of Imagineers or individuals who would want to become Imagineers to, in a sense, blow the socks off of Walt or the legends that we've explored this season?
Great question. I'm going to answer that question by giving you the 3 rules that I give to my classes at CalArts for becoming a fearlessly creative person. Rule number 1 is celebrate breaking the rules. You know, I think my earliest rule breaking happened when I was in the 3rd grade and I wanted to sing my grandmother the Star-Spangled Banner, and I couldn't remember the final stanza, and she looked at me and she said, "Just make it up." And I said, "Grandma, you're allowed to do that with a song like the Star-Spangled Banner?" She said, "Sure, why not?" So I did, right? And once I realized that breaking the rules creatively, if your intent was pure and honest, was okay, it was unbelievably freeing. The second rule I would say is learn to love the blank page. And the blank page, so I gave you pictures of a book that Marty gifted to a lot of us, right? For me, the blank page has always been the most exciting thing in the world, because until you put something on it, that something doesn't exist. And whether you put a drawing on it or a series of words that become a story or a flow chart that becomes an experience diagram, you are creating something for the very first time. And being able to create is a gift that you have to honor, but it's also comes from a muscle that you have to continue to flex and work. So fall in love with the blank page and fill it as much as you can and as often as you can. And my third rule would be capture your own aha moments and don't lose sight of them. So as we grow up, we tend to lose sight of what was magical for us in the world because we get beaten down with too much reality. Write them down, right? Write them down in a place where you can revisit them, and do revisit them. So I talked a little bit in the interview about going to, at almost 10 years old, to New York for the first time and seeing great moments with Mr. Lincoln. That was an aha moment. Another aha moment, which happened to me at that point in my life, was seeing a Broadway play for the first time. And it was Funny Girl with Barbra Streisand, right? And I wrote down on the program 2 aha moments, what I now call aha moments, I didn't then, from that play. And one of them just had to do with the way the scenery got changed. The idea that you could roll pieces of scenery and furniture from one place into another place, and when it turned backwards, it would be something completely different than when it was forwards, was like an aha moment to me, that I'm glad I never lost sight of, right? Much of my career in Hollywood, happened, my ability to pay the bills and then make a living, because I thought fencing was cool and my college sport was competitive fencing. I was at the University of Colorado where they had a Shakespeare festival, and there was a director who wanted to learn how to make cool fantasy weapons. So, I kind of knew how to fence. I kind of knew the technique. I kind of knew the way the stuff got built. So I learned how to work with aircraft aluminum and build big fantasy stuff. Cut to, I'm graduating from Cal Arts and I need a job. And there are suddenly movies called The Sword and the Sorcerer and Conan and Wizards and Warriors, right? And a designer who could build fantasy weapons out of aircraft aluminum that were light enough for actors to rehearse with and film with during movies became a really in-demand thing, right? That ultimately led to directing second units on some of those movies and directing stunt units, right? And stuff, and so, but that was a threaded series of aha moments, right? That I followed through my life until they led to a conclusion, that ultimately paid off. So celebrate breaking the rules, number 1. 2, love the blank page, use it often and flex the muscles that fill it. 3, capture your own aha moments and don't lose sight of what leads them down a path that you might not know yet, but hopefully someday you will learn about.
These are all really great tips, and I know that I'm taking them deep into my creative heart. And you've talked to us about Walt possibly thinking that the parks would be underwhelming and the advice that you would give to potential Imagineers. Let's take it a step further and talk about what you would like to see from Imagineering in the future.
I started my company, Reimagine Well, with a number of former Disney Imagineers who had found a place in their life where being a part of the healing process for people who were navigating the journey from diagnosis through treatment and on into healing and well-being not necessarily being wellness, was something they wanted to do with their lives. One of those Imagineers isn't with us anymore. They died of cancer after they started working on those projects, but they left behind a really big legacy in about 8 pediatric hospitals in the U.S. That's where I plan to spend the last chapter of my life and my creative life. My dream is that there will be many more students who graduate from Cal Arts and Imagineers who graduate from Imagineering that use their talents to develop experience design in ways that heal people, planets, and societies.
So they can help create aha moments for others.
Yeah.
Again, wow. Thank you. Thank you for sharing everything. Your story is pretty amazing, sir.
Yeah, I kind of know that. And I kind of feel extraordinarily, lucky and gifted, in a lot of ways, I briefly, are any of you old enough to remember Siskel and Ebert?
Oh, yeah.
We were talking about that earlier, actually.
So
I loved watching them.
So I briefly got to meet Roger Ebert when they used to do film reviews and film cruises on the Disney Cruise Line. Roger and I got diagnosed with basically the same cancer in the same year. And people used to say to me, "Oh, you're the other Roger that got diagnosed with thyroid cancer." I mean, as you know, 4.5 years later, Roger Ebert was gone. And I won't recommend watching the documentary if you're going to work on it. I mean, about him. It's one of the roughest documentaries I've ever seen in my life. It's Chasing Life. If you, I'm assuming none of you have seen it. Anyway, it's rough. He lets people he puts you very up close and personal with a man being tortured to death, right?
Wow.
But anyway, I feel, so me 16 years later, if it's open, I'll be doing the Malibu Triathlon this September for the 16th time. Right?
Wow.
And I'll be doing Bike MS for the 10th time. Right. I'm still doing 3 events a year, and I feel really blessed in a lot of ways. My wife and I both left entertainment at the same time and went into healthcare. She in a very different way, but we look at each other every day and go, we could not be more lucky. So yeah, I'm giving back where I can.
Well, we thank you for that, and thank you for creating the things that we love at the Disney parks, and thank you for all that you're doing now in the world today. How can our listeners learn more about you outside of the show?
I'd say if someone reaches out to me through Reimagine Well and says, you know what, I have an idea of how adults might utilize immersive healing experiences the way your kids do, and I'd like to help you pilot that at my hospital in my town, I'm going to call them 20 minutes later. So I guess I would say, if someone wants to find out more about me as a human being, or me and my career, really, they can go to my Wikipedia page. If they want to find out more about me and what matters to me, they can go to reimaginewell.com. And if they want to reach out to me, it should be through reimaginewell.com. There's a contact form there.
Perfect.
We hope that you enjoyed these stories. Be sure to join us next time as we have even more stories from another Walt Disney Imagineer.